Hey, good afternoon, Tom. Good afternoon, Tom. I'm ready to start the debate, opening statements, and give you a chance to have your opening statement. So, white privilege, according to the Wikipedia definition, is a term for societal privileges that benefit white people in Western countries beyond what is commonly experienced by non-white people under the same social, political, or economic circumstances. It means basically white people have the upper hand and advantage, a lot more things that cater to them socially, politically in Western civilization than for blacks. The notion of white privilege, in my opinion, suggests, like in Wikipedia definitions, that non-white non-whites cannot overcome this burden, where you start in life, because there's this giant bear out there called white privilege trying to beat black people down. And even if you make all the right decisions in life and do all the right things and not the wrong things in life, you still won't succeed because there's this privilege, that's white privilege. I assert my position, and I believe that there is no such thing as white privilege, and I believe white privilege isn't a reality. It's a cowardly way to blame someone else for your failures to live up to decent, responsible standards. And I wrap up my opening statement and we'll give you, Tom, a chance to respond.
All right. First, to narrow the inquiry, the prompt is about white privilege in America. I know you're in Australia, but the prompt is about America, so all my prep has been about white privilege in America. As far as the definition of white privilege defined academically, and if you read Wikipedia, you were using Becky McIntosh's article from 1989, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. It's like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. It's about unearned strength, or earned strength versus unearned power. There's nothing in that definition that says that people of other races can't overcome white privilege in America. White privilege is, in fact, describing a structural advantage that white people enjoy in America, and not a universal privilege. It's about structures and not about individuals. Second, when we're discussing white privilege in America, Occam's razor is key. It's easy when we're discussing white privilege to get bogged down in the individual bricks of the wall of white privilege, but that causes us to ignore the wall as a whole. Third, when we're talking about white privilege, it's easy to get bogged down in the ropes that we have thrown people of color to get over the wall that is white privilege. And we have to remember the wall is still there no matter what we have done to make up for it. Now, it's simply true that in the United States of America, on the whole, in the aggregate, white people are significantly more powerful. White people are ahead of all other minority races in terms of poverty rates, home ownership, educational attainment, job attainment, representation in political structures, especially in Congress. We may get into the specifics of those later. It's simply a fact that white people, as it stands in every objective measure, are better off in America. The concept of white privilege is asking why that is. Is it about what individual white people have done, or is there a structure in place that gives white people a leg up that other races don't experience? So another thing that's been said about white privilege, white skin in the United States opens many doors for whites, whether or not we approve of the way that dominance has been conferred on whites. It's not something that whites do. It's something that whites are simply born with. So in this debate, I will be taking the position that there is such a thing as white privilege in America, despite any individualized examples that seem to run counter to that general structural sentiment.
Well, you talked about structure privilege, so I'm going to start with that. According to the liberal Brookings Institute, if you do not want to be permanently poor in the U.S., it's actually very easy. And there's three things that they list that you need to do. And it doesn't care about race. This completely challenges the structure argument. First is finish high school, get a job, don't get pregnant before you're married. That's it. If you do these three things, and this is seriously in the United States, because I'm actually from the United States, not Australia. Just to correct that point, you will not be permanently poor in the United States, and and so that's according to the Liberal Brookings Institute. Now, you talk about the disproportionate poverty rate in the Black community compared to whites. The reason why is because there's a disproportionate single motherhood rate and dropout rate in the Black community as compared to the white community. That doesn't communicate white privilege. It's just people in the Black community are making bad decisions versus people in the white community. More of them are decisions, and I will look to elaborate on that further on and give further examples. Now, according to the Liberal Brookings Institute, again, the single motherhood rate in Black community is in the 1960s was 20%. Today, it actually jumped to 70%. And now, if you're going to argue that racism in the U.S. has more than tripled in the same time period that the civil rights movement have had great success, I'm going to constantly challenge you and say this is pure nonsense. Now with that, I'm gonna give you a chance to respond.
What you pointed out are the first of a couple of common bricks that are brought up when we're talking about the wall of white privilege. That communities of color, and again, we're not just talking about Black communities, we're also talking about non-white Hispanics, Native American communities, mixed race communities. It is true that the educational attainment rate is lower in those communities than in white communities. The high school dropout rate is higher, the single motherhood rate is higher, but the single motherhood rate is in fact up across the board. It's simply still higher in communities of color than it is in white communities. But again, you're talking about individual bricks. You're talking in terms of individual decisions. Yet you're pointing to aggregate facts. You in fact made the statement that people in the Black community, your words, are making bad decisions, while people in the white community are making good decisions. White privilege would say that there are structural advantages in place that allow people in those white communities to make the better decisions versus African Americans. Now, you talk about the comparative rates of single motherhood and comparative rates versus the prior generation to this generation. One piece of white privilege is generational attainment. Because white people have had disproportionately more power in America, starting from the very founding of America until today, people who are born into whiteness have more opportunities to make those good decisions. So, for instance, you point out that going back to the pre-civil rights era, that white people had advantages that African Americans and people of color have started to reclaim. But the children of those pre-civil rights era people are the current sort of reigning adults, the baby boomers and Generation X in America, who, because their parents had those power structures in place, were able to make better decisions than people in communities of color where the institutionalized racial discrimination helped hold them down. And that tends to trickle down. Even if you start to chip away at that brick in the wall, the structures are still in place. And that's why, even though we have things like the Civil Rights Act, we still see that doctor's degrees, for example, conferred by post-secondary institutions, whites are still overrepresented compared to where they stand in the population. 62.8% of Americans are white. It's 69.3% of degrees conferred, whereas white, blacks, Hispanics, and mixed race people fall behind. Same with master's degrees. It's a structural problem, not an individual decision problem.
All right. Okay. Just to correct the point, I said more whites are making better decisions than are blacks. That's just what I said. Just to clarify and the point you made earlier. Now, to say that there's institutional racism, and to continue on this point, you have to highlight the institutions where this racism is happening, and until you're able to just say that, I'm going to continue to look at that comment as just something vague, as just something to just completely throw out there because of the fact you don't see a certain you see disproportionate representation in a certain institution. So you have to highlight the institution, and you have to provide the evidence to really show that there is institutional racism because of the fact that the forefathers who were white actually set it in place a certain way to keep blacks out. Until you're able to provide that, the burden of proof is on you to actually solidify your point that there is white privilege in the United States. Now, the greatest privilege in American life, according to my research, the way that I see it, and this is again according to the Liberal Brookings Institute, it, from what I said in the Liberal Brookings Institute, it's not white privilege. It's actually being born into a two-parent family, and that's true for every race. It doesn't matter if you're Asian. It just doesn't matter. The poverty rate amongst two-parent black families, according to the Liberal Brookings Institute, is 7%. Poverty rate in single white motherhood homes is 22%. Now you have to what happened to white privilege in this scenario? Why aren't those single white mothers doing better than those two-parent black families? And with that, I'm going to give you a chance to make a comment.
All right, so you want to talk about specific institutions. Let's first start with the most obvious institutions, which are our political institutions. Today in this country, again, 62.8% of Americans are white, non-Hispanic, yet only 21% of the members of the House and 10% of the members of the United States Senate are people of color. In the states that have the highest percentage, we'll go with black people because the whites and white Hispanics are not broken down at the federal level properly for this stat. Mississippi, most black state in the nation, 37.4% black, only 25% of their congressional delegation is black. Louisiana, 32.1% black, 1 black congressman out of 6. Georgia, 30.9% black, 2 black congressmen out of 14. My own state of Tennessee, we have the 10th largest black population in the country, no minority congressmen or senators, not even coming out of Memphis, which is majority black. Even in state legislatures or in states that are majority minority of all colors. California is a majority minority state when you combine both African Americans and Hispanics, yet only 17 of their 53 representatives to Congress are minorities. So you can see the political power structure, even as we've creeped towards egalitarianism, still leans towards whites. Another power structure is the job market. There have been several studies done on black versus white resumes in the job market, where you take someone with equal qualifications on paper, you give one person a traditionally white sounding name, one person a traditionally Hispanic or African American sounding name. The study by Forbes found that for every 10 resumes that a white sounding name resume was sent out, there was 1 callback. Black resumes were 50% less likely to get responded to. There's your evidence of the economic structure. We've already talked about the educational structures, that white people are still disproportionately more likely to earn master's degrees and doctor's degrees. They're disproportionately more likely to go to college. Now you talk about the structures of family choice and single motherhood versus two-parent households. One of the biggest pressures on divorce, I know this as an attorney, is economics. Poor people are far more likely to get divorced. Who's more likely to be poor? People of color. Again, this goes back to the Occam's razor problem. You can point to these individual examples of, well, here are bad decisions people are making, but it's the power structures that help force those decisions.
Now you talk about the political structure. Okay, now with the political structure, why don't you take into account the decision making of certain people in those black neighborhoods and in the black community and the Hispanics as a potential explanation for why they lack representation? How about why isn't career choices in the equation? Why is it automatically racism? And I'll give you a chance to respond.
See, and there's one of the There's one of the bugaboos is when you throw the word racism into a discussion of white privilege. It's not about racism. Racism is active discrimination by an individual against a particular race. White privilege is about the structures of power that benefit white people disproportionately versus people of color. It's a macro observation. It's an observation that has to do with structures and not individual choice. But since you brought it up, the lack of minority representation in politics is not reflective just of individual choice. In fact, the reason that we have fewer minorities in Congress than we do in the general population has to do with the structure of Congress, which is created through gerrymandering. Overwhelmingly, when white people who have historically been in power in Congress have drawn up district lines have been drawn historically with an eye toward race. We had to pass a law in this country, and we have a continuing court oversight to try to keep this from happening, but it keeps happening where even if all the African Americans, say in a given state, go out to vote, they are voting in a smaller number of congressional districts proportionate to their population than whites are. That's how you end up with only 2 congressmen from Georgia who are African Americans, because those population centers of African Americans are drawn into the same couple of congressional districts, mostly in Atlanta, just as an example. But as I pointed out, in Tennessee, where we have a disproportionately black major city in Memphis, that has been gerrymandered with a lot of surrounding white areas so that they are represented by a white person. And this is an example of a macro structure. Now you keep going back to you mentioned individual choice when it comes to job attainment. Well, an individual can't just choose to pursue a doctorate or a master's degree. They have to be accepted into a program. They can't just choose to go to a higher paying job. They have to be interviewed and then hired. When you look at the structural challenges that are facing some people seeking those positions, that's where we get back to the problem, again, of the black versus the white resume. It's been demonstrated time and time again. If you whitewash a resume with a white-sounding name, that resume is more likely to get responses. And when we talk about a white-sounding name, we're talking about a normative-sounding name. And white privilege at its core is the normalizing of whiteness. We are taught to believe that if it sounds white, it sounds normal, and normal is where everybody wants to start. Everybody else is starting at a lower level, and that's what white privilege is.
Well, I believe we're given 2 different definitions. I'm addressing two different definitions than what you're addressing. However, I provided the statistical information. I gave it's like I talked about why all of these things are false. Now you can go into talking about the political representation, but you're not taking into account the decisions of certain people in these communities. Most people do not want. Certain people do not want a career in politics. That doesn't mean that the system is some way structured in order to favor whites. It just means that there's not enough black people or other minorities interested in going to these fields. I can't quite remember at the moment. I believe you talked about a name, like they look at a name. I mean, how do you assess whether a name is white or black? I mean, probably Asian, probably Russian, but how do you assess that? What's the explanation? I mean, there's just some flaws in some of the argumentations you're providing. They sound good on the surface, but I mean, they're really not making any sense. And I don't remember hearing a source for where you said with regards to talking about a name of they'll favor whites more often than they'll favor blacks, and in the job market, that's really a disadvantage. And I don't need a source for this. It's really a disadvantage for if that were to be true for them to do that, because of the fact you're really barring certain people with certain skill sets from going into your workforce to make you more competitive in a market economy. So in many facets, the information you're providing is just not making any sense cohesively. And with that, I'll just allow you to respond.
Okay, you asked for a source. There have been several different studies with regard to the resumes, but the specific one I was citing was by the National Bureau of Economic Research. It was a field study by Marianne Bertrand and Senthil Mulianathan. You can find more about that on politifact.com. There's a similar study that was cited in Forbes magazine. You keep backing off, though, to these individualized judgments. There's not enough black people who want to go into politics. There's not enough black people who want to do X. There's not enough people of color who want this job. There's not enough people of color who want to pursue these degrees. But what you keep ignoring is that white privilege is a question of structures, and it's a question of macro facts. Why are people of color not seeking at the exact same rate as whites these same positions? Why are they not achieving them at the same rate as whites, proportionate to their population, proportionate to their inborn skills? The answer lies in white privilege. Now, we keep pointing to these other factors, poverty and two-parent households and single motherhood. But why is it that despite all of the different acts that we've passed, the Civil Rights Act, affirmative action in our universities, diversity hiring programs, the EEOC, all of these ropes that we have thrown over the wall to try to get people who are not born white to the same level on an equal playing field with white people. We've thrown all these ropes over the wall, and yet even you concede that in every measurable metric, whether it's poverty, whether it's family situation, whether it's educational attainment, whether it's political power, minorities fall behind white people in America. It's because as many times as we throw the ropes over the wall, and as many times as we say, here's a brick where we can explain why this person fell behind. Here's a brick and explain why this person didn't pursue this opportunity. Here's a brick up here that shows this white person is somehow more special than these minorities. You're ignoring the wall. It's a structural problem in America, and the demographics bear it up, that no matter how many different things we try to pull minorities over that wall, the wall of white privilege still exists. Now we'll go back to the very root definition of white privilege. It is unearned power, power that whites have whether they earn it or not. It is an invisible knapsack. It's like the air that we breathe. You can say, I can't see it in front of me, but it's there. And so is white privilege.
Well, again, we're given two different definitions. White privilege to me is, again, the term used by for societal privileges that benefit white people in Western countries beyond what is commonly experienced by non-white people under the same social, political, or economic circumstances. White people have the upper hand, and there is nothing that blacks can do to get over that hump, socially or politically in the United States civilization. And I gave the statistics that actually talk about the reason I provide life decisions is because based on the decision you're making, and based on if you got a steady job or if you don't have kids, it depends on it really influences your potential with regards to how much success you may have. And I also provided the evidence for the example where you have a single mother who is white, and you have a black family who is married. Now, I didn't provide the information regards to what their education levels are, but that scenario completely debunks the idea that whites have a central advantage from the time they were, of their ancestors have set for them that really keeps blacks white. Because if this was the case, in that scenario, you would expect the white single mother to be doing way better financially than the black married families. And also, also you would expect a scenario where a single mother who has not finished high school to also be doing better than a African American or black or African American woman financially. And this is not the case. and it completely debunks the idea of white privilege. And so, to the audience, I believe I provided a solid case. I believe I gave evidence. I believe my opponent kind of like tried to, I don't know, sort of swear around the actual definition of white privilege and given other connotations, connotations that I'm not going to address, because of the fact that that's not what that's not what the actual what definition of white privilege is. So with that, I thank my opponent Tom for engaging me in this debate, and I hope that I can concede with your vote. Thank you very much, and have a good time, Tom.